This video may contain content that some may find triggering or offensive. Please watch at your own risk. Alright, welcome back everyone. Today we'll be discussing the third episode of the Percy Jackson Disney Plus TV show. Took me a while to put this review together because script writing and editing takes up a lot more time than I anticipated, but hopefully things will smooth out as we go along. And big thanks for all the engagement on the previous episode. A lot more comments than I thought there would be, but I had fun exchanging some thoughts and talking with some of you guys, so thanks for that. Alright, without further ado, let's get into the third episode of the show. Let's get one thing out of the way first, because there were some things that became very apparent as I was watching this particular episode. People online often make the argument that this show is much more faithful to the books than the movies. Now, using this episode as an example, you can pretty much describe the events with very broad strokes, and it can match up with the books quite nicely. The trio start the quest, they travel to Manhattan and take a bus to New Jersey. On said bus, they are attacked by Mrs. Dodds and her sisters. They flee the scene and end up encountering MEDUSA, who they kill by the classic method of decapitation and mail her head to Olympus. This description can be used to describe both the book and the episode. However, the devil is in the details, and this is no exception. But back to the episode itself. Like I mentioned in my previous video, the details surrounding the reasoning to embark on the quest, the conflict between Zeus and Poseidon, were zipped past at the speed of sound and given no space for consideration or audience reaction. Likewise, this episode starts with Percy visiting the Oracle, who gives him the prophecy about the quest to retrieve the lightning bolt. Again, if they dedicated 5 to 10 minutes of the beginning of the episode to lay out the premise of the quest and the goals they had to achieve, as well as the weight of the quest, I think it would have made for a very strong start. But the show doesn't even give the Oracle much explanation, besides a few throwaway lines by the characters. It feels like the show is relying on the audience's knowledge of the books in order for the scene to be more impactful, instead of explaining things clearly and concisely within the confines of the show itself. The actual Oracle encounter is semi-accurate to the book, where the Oracle delivers the prophecy through a projected image of Gabe, but comparing the book to the show reveals a very different tone. In the book, the Oracle's rasping voice speaks through Gabe's image, giving the scene a very unsettling and creepy vibe. But in the show, Gabe just speaks with his regular voice, and it results in some jarring tonal inconsistency, in my opinion. He just sounds goofy. In fact, I don't even think the Oracle speaks with her own voice at all in the show, and this is why I feel like the show's version of the Oracle doesn't set it up as a mysterious prophetic entity that everyone is low-key creeped out by, especially knowing what happens later in the story. Titan's Curse Forest scene. Moving on, the quest selection scene also irks me just a bit. Now, this is a bit of a nitpick, but I did warn you I was going to nitpick. But in the book, Annabeth volunteers to go on the quest, because she's been waiting to go on one her entire life. While in the show, Percy is the one who picks her to go with him on the quest. Now, I don't really have a problem with this in theory, but Percy's reasoning for picking her, to me, seems kind of sketchy. He claims later in the episode he chose her specifically because he never thought they would ever be friends, and therefore she wouldn't betray him, because that's what the Oracle told him, that he would be betrayed by one who calls him a friend. But do you know who else probably wouldn't be his friend, and therefore couldn't fit the criteria? Yeah, Clarice. She was standing in the lineup with everybody else. And arguably, based on what they've showed me in the TV show, you'd think that Clarice hates him, they hates his guts. They had a really bad introduction, they fought. She basically wiped the floor with him until he beat her with the power of Deus Ex Machina. But according to Percy's own criteria, I feel like Clarice actually felt like a better fit than Annabeth. And obviously, it is shown to us in the show that Clarice is far more adept at combat, even though they keep telling us Annabeth was the greatest. We never actually seen her do anything at this point. And as we know later on in the books, if you're a reader, you know that Clarice indeed does wipe the floor with some very high-tier monsters. Maybe, again, that's just another nitpick of mine, but it is something that kind of made that scene a bit weird for me. So, after all that selecting is said and done, the trio then sets off. But not, of course, before a mandatory exposition dump about Thalia, the second one of the show, if I may remind you. But I kind of like this one because TV Percy does end up saying a line that sounds like it came straight from Book Percy's mouth.
She fought valiantly, and she met a hero's fate.
She met a pinecone's fate.
It's at this point where the story starts to diverge quite considerably from the book, while still staying underneath those broad strokes I mentioned near the beginning of the video. But first, a word on the dynamics between the characters, particularly Percy and Annabeth, though I generally can count Grover in this as well. I made it clear in the previous video that TV Annabeth comes across as very bossy, standoffish, and authoritative, traits which book Annabeth somewhat shared but never exhibited to such an infuriating degree. The comparison of this section of the story between the TV show and the book shows the difference pretty well, I feel. While Annabeth takes jabs at Percy in both versions of the story, book Percy actually jabs back a lot of the time, and it results in a lot of fun banter between the two, as they call each other derogatory nicknames like Seaweed Brain and Wise Girl, names that of course will eventually be used in an endearing way between them. Even though Annabeth is a bit miffed at Percy and is distant at times, she still shows her appreciation to him without coming across as bossy and stuck up. There were even moments where they laughed together. There's one very brief scene in the book where the three of them are playing hacky sack with one of Grover's apples while waiting for the bus, and Grover ends the round by snatching one of the apples out of the air and chomping it down in one bite. And you know what happens? They all laugh about it together, all three of them. They still feel like an unlikely friend group. On the other hand, TV Annabeth is like if you microwaved all the good stuff away from book Annabeth and get left with one of those shallow, modern, girl boss characters who people think that are epic just because they order everyone around or are better than everyone else. Most notably, she shuts down any chance of a consensus vote between the three of them, ironic considering her mother's the goddess of democracy, and she gets into arguments with Percy pretty often, in the forest and in Medusa's lair. It doesn't feel like there are any moments of true friendship with the TV trio at this point of the story. And I'm also counting the fact that Grover snitched on Percy to get him kicked out of school, which really soured their relationship from the get-go, and it still feels like it hasn't recovered fully. This leads nicely into one of my most anticipated scenes that I wanted to see adapted to the screen, the Fury attack on the bus. So, in the book, this is the first high-stakes action scene that sets the tone for the rest of the story, and upon a reread, I found that it was a lot of fun. Mrs. Dodds and her sisters get on the bus and slowly make their way to the back where the trio is sitting. There's a sense of dread and anticipation as Percy realizes that his teacher is back and is coming for him, and that he has no place to run or hide. Annabeth then comes up with a clever plan to conceal Percy with her invisibility cap and sneak him off the bus that way. When things go wrong and the Furies transform and attack Annabeth and Grover with flaming whips, Percy, still invisible, grabs hold of the steering wheel and yanks the bus back and forth, trying to throw off the monsters. Then, when the bus comes to a stop and the passengers evacuate, all three of the demigods work together to take down two of the Furies, and they end up escaping the bus just as Mrs. Dodds calls down lightning from the sky and blows the bus up in a glorious fiery explosion. And as the kids flee, they're caught on camera and start to be labeled as juvenile delinquent fugitives. Now, if that sounds awesome, that's because it is. So, did the show end up capturing any of that energy? Yeah, so to say this was a disappointment was an understatement. First of all, Annabeth has a full conversation or negotiation with Mrs. Dodds, which immediately kills a lot of the tension present in the book version. Mrs. Dodds also comments that Annabeth is the most powerful demigod of her generation, or something along those lines, which again seems like another attempt to ham Annabeth up as some sort of unstoppable girl boss. This is like the second or third time this has happened in the show, and another really grating example of show don't tell. In the book, Annabeth is the one who comes up with the plan to try and sneak Percy off the bus. It shows off her quick thinking skills and her assessment of a dangerous situation. While she does end up taking out a Fury in the TV show by chucking her dagger at it, Percy and Grover are sidelined hard, doing nothing to contribute except to run away. I liked the book because it showed them all working together to take down the monsters, and it also gave us a glimpse at Percy's fatal flaw, where he went back to help his friends even though he had an opportunity to escape. But aside from that, the TV scene just has no energy. It happens super fast, and then it's over before you can blink. There was absolutely no tension or excitement in the scene, the Furies did not seem like a threat whatsoever, and it overall left a bad taste in my mouth. Just a sad, wet fart of a scene. But then we get to the star of the show, Medusa, who literally just walks up to them and announces to the entire world who she is.
It's a pleasure to meet you, son of Poseidon. I'm Medusa.
Alright, so, I've seen arguments of people saying that this was done because it would have been unrealistic for the kids to not know who Auntie M was, considering they're walking into a place filled with stone statues. But keep in mind that in the book, they were tired, famished, delirious, and ready to collapse after fleeing from a monster fight and trekking through the forest for hours. The scent of Auntie M's burgers and fries was so enticing they couldn't think straight, and it was also implied that the smell of the food could have been enchanted in some way. Only Grover gave the slightest hint that something was wrong, as he could smell monsters, but Percy and Annabeth were too famished to do anything about it. While the reader could pretty much piece together that it was Medusa, a lot of the tension came from the characters not knowing what they were getting into and slowly discovering where they were over the course of the scene. Once again, none of that is in the TV show. Granted, the situation is a bit different, where they had to choose between going with Medusa or fighting Mrs. Dodds, but honestly, if I were them, I'd take my chances with Mrs. Dodds. At this point in the TV show, they've already killed her accidentally, and killed her sister, which establishes that Furies are not particularly threatening. It'd be a piece of cake for them. But of course, for the plot to happen, they go with Medusa. Now, during the scene, where Medusa serves them food, she implies that she is a survivor of her relationship with Poseidon. In the book, the way it was explained was that the relationship was consensual, and that Athena got angry when she caught the two of them doing the hanky-panky in her temple. Nothing particularly wrong with this interpretation, but as expected, the modern thing to do was to turn Medusa into the victim of the situation. Now, I'm by no means an expert in the different iterations of Medusa, and I didn't really have any strong feelings towards the version that they went with in the show. But what I did have slight issue with was that it now frames Percy's dad as not a very good guy. I know the Olympians weren't perfect, but if you're gonna paint one of the gods in that light, Zeus is literally right there. And we all know that mythology Zeus is an absolutely despicable character. But then, Medusa drops the innocent facade and asks Percy to go into the kitchen with her, something he literally should be smart enough to avoid, but he does it anyway. And then she drops the sweet act and offers to help kill his friends. It's after this, when Percy flees, does Medusa take off her hat and reveal herself. And not gonna lie, you know, she's looking pretty good, if you know what I mean. Be gone, thought! Okay, real talk, but Medusa's design in the show is really boring. Sure, she has the iconic snake hair and some pretty cool eyes, but other than that, she just looks like a normal person. Myth Medusa has so much more eye-popping descriptions. Sometimes she has talons or claws. Sometimes she has scales. Sometimes her skin is a different color. Even the book leans more into describing her, or at least the parts of her that are visible, because the characters never look at her face directly. And her hair in the TV show is just so non-dynamic. When I see a version of Medusa on screen, I want her hair to feel alive and independent from her. Take Medusa from that Clash of the Titans movie back in 2010. Sure, the movie may have been lackluster, but at least they did something cool by turning Medusa's body into a serpent, therefore giving her tons of mobility and making her feel like a genuine threat. But here, it just looks like someone dumped a bucket of sleepy snakes on her head and called it a day, and then she just walks around really slowly. She doesn't feel dangerous at all. And so, we get to the climax of the show, set in a giant underground cavern where Medusa keeps her statues. I think the set design is pretty cool. You could do a lot with it. Have Medusa chase them through the labyrinth of statues, take advantage of the claustrophobic atmosphere and the darkness to really give us a sense of dread, make Medusa feel like an inevitable force that's out to get them no matter what. And, of course, the show does absolutely nothing with it. The characters stand around and talk a bit. Medusa just walks forward a few paces, and then she gets killed with the most brain-dead and convoluted plan in history. Grover accidentally distracts Medusa, Annabeth sneaks the invisibility cap onto her, Percy takes a blind swing, and he somehow manages to decapitate her without missing, and her head rolls off her shoulders and lands on the ground without the hat even falling off.
I think I can smell shite.
It was at this point that I realized something. The rating of the show is holding it back, to its detriment. Being a PG-rated show on Disney Plus was not a good fit for Percy Jackson. Because when you read the books, there's a surprising amount of violence for a middle grade series. Granted, most of the violence is directed toward the monsters, and the demigods rarely suffer fatal injuries, but this does change in later books, where the tone of the story turns more dire and more serious. Medusa's decapitation was watered down to the extreme, likely due to the fact that Disney wouldn't allow a decapitation to be shown on screen. But I think they could have figured out how to do it in a creative way. Even in the book, the entire scene is described without the characters looking at her head directly. They don't even look at it once it's cut off, instead wrapping it out of sight immediately. I think they could have easily pulled this off with some clever camera work and direction, but instead they decided to go with a nonsensical plan that required Olympus-sized amounts of plot armor and suspensions of disbelief in order to work. Not to mention they got rid of the fact that in the book they defeated her in a similar way to how she was killed in the myth, with Percy using a reflective garden orb to see her reflection. And then, holding the invisible head, which by the way looks super silly, Percy goes outside and petrifies Mrs. Dodds. I mean, what? They do realize Mrs. Dodds comes back in later books, right? She's not a major character or anything, but she's still around doing stuff for Hades. What are they gonna do now? Explain that Hades can suddenly depetrify Medusa's victims? Honestly, I'm pretty sure that they threw this part in just to show off Medusa's powers, since in the book she doesn't actually petrify anyone. Funnily enough, they did this in the movie as well, where they threw in a random character just to be killed by her. You know, I wonder how that conversation went. So we have Medusa in the script, and she doesn't actually petrify anyone in the book, so how are we supposed to show her off as a threat without actually killing any of the main characters? Oh, I know! Why don't we make it so that she uses her powers on a random mortal that happened to wander into her lair? Oh, that's great. So, I just realized that I never showed Medusa petrify anyone in the books, and that's a staple power of hers, and I want to show it off. Ooh, why don't we make the most convoluted situation where Mrs. Dodds pursues them, and then in the end, after they kill Medusa, they're gonna hold her invisible head, go outside, and petrify Mrs. Dodds with it. This will definitely not have any consequences down the road. That sounds like a great idea. I'm sure the movie, which we are trying not to imitate at all, didn't go through this thought process at all. Anyway, after that sorry excuse of an action scene, there's some very riveting arguments back and forth between the characters, which results in Percy deciding to mail Medusa's head to Olympus. Grover also finds a statue of his Uncle Ferdinand, which I found really funny because it reminded me that in the movie, despite changing so much of the main plot, the one thing that they decided to keep faithful to the book for some reason was the fact that Grover sees a statue of his Uncle Ferdinand, who had been killed by Medusa. I don't know, that's just really hilarious to me. They also take a line directly from the book, where Percy claims that he is impertinent. Again, maybe they were hoping for fans to go ooh over this reference, because it is taken directly from the book. But it doesn't really work in the context of the show. Percy is far more impertinent and snarkier in the book, and in the TV show, because he's been watered down so much, it just doesn't have the same impact. And I don't feel like this line is justified because of it. This is honestly the first impertinent thing he's done in the entire show so far. Grover also returns to his character-assassinated role as the exposition machine, where he, for some reason, explains everything about Annabeth's invisibility kept to Percy, instead of Annabeth being the one to explain it herself, like it was in the book. Honestly, the way Grover was acting like an assertive middleman or mediator did not match his character in the book at all. You might as well call them two different characters at this point. You know what? Maybe that's not a bad idea. Alright. From this point onwards, I'm gonna call a non-impertinent TV Percy Peter Johnson, rude girl boss Annabeth Anna Boss, and exposition dump Grover the lean, mean exposition machine. Just kidding, I'm calling him Steve. OMG everyone, look, it's Hamilton!